Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of TekTalk with Sodhi. Not just another entrepreneurship show. Here, we don't just talk about innovations, we also talk about the journey, the sacrifices, and the untold stories behind the headlines. Well, today we are honored to have Francesca Augustine. She's an innovative entrepreneur who is reshaping the intersection of art and technology with her venture, Network. With a background deeply rooted in the arts and a relentless passion for entrepreneurship, Francesca brings a unique perspective to the startup world. Francesca, welcome to Tech Talk. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
For the listeners, could you tell a bit about your background and your journey till now? I mean, how your journey went from arts to entrepreneurship, how did it unfold, and what inspired you to venture into the startup space?
Of course. And if you had asked me 10 years ago if I would be doing this today, there's no way that I would say yes. And in fact, how it got started is someone asked me to curate an NFT exhibition. And at the time, I was like, I'm not even sure if I know what that is, and I don't think I'm interested. But he continued to kind of question me and ask me a little bit. And the more that I read about it, the thing that really piqued my interest was the opportunity for artists to receive continuous royalties on the sale of their artworks. Now, this is something that we have never had access to, not because there wasn't a desire, but there really wasn't any way to do it. And that really intrigued me. So I dipped my toes in a little bit. We decided to curate an exhibition where we were reaching out to American art students to kind of see how the young people were reacting. I had been teaching at the time, so I had some relationships with some universities, and we put out this call, which not a single American art student applied to, but the call was picked up and went international. And we ended up getting applications from artists all over the world, including 5 continents. And this really helped me recognize this is something people wanted, particularly because those who applied, the majority were women. And a large number were people of color living in locations that are not traditional art centers, New York, Paris, for example. And what it meant to me was that there are people who really desire to participate that just do not have the access to participate. And that also intrigued me. But what I learned from this experience of working on this exhibition, that all of those claims about artists receiving continuous royalties, et cetera, wasn't actually built into the products that we were utilizing. And I would ask these questions. It was like, so how are the artists going to receive continuous royalties? How do we set up their wallets? Are they aware of that? What happens if you, the person who was organizing the exhibition, goes out of business? Who calculates that? There was all of these questions where it was like immediately you say, oh, this great thing is going to happen. And then I was like, okay, so explain to me how it works. And I realized that there was a lot of infrastructure that needed to be built to actualize the promises that were being made to artists and others. And I looked for people who were doing that because I thought, okay, this is interesting. I'm interested. There's got to be somebody who's, has some understanding of the art market that's more aligned with who I am and where I've been working. And I couldn't find it. I mean, I was constantly talking to business and tech people with almost no knowledge of the art world who were building things that didn't actually make sense for who we are. And finally, I said to a good friend of mine, I said, somebody has got to build this. And he just looked at me and said, yeah. And I was like, me? I'm an artist and an art entrepreneur. I mean, my mother actually has a tech background. So that's kind of interesting that, it's like suddenly worlds collide. But the first thing I did was take a course at Oxford University at business school on blockchain strategy. And that's when I got a much deeper understanding for how it works, how it can work. And it helped me pinpoint some of the serious need to build infrastructure to actually work that I wasn't seeing elsewhere. And that helped me form what is now Network today and what we needed to build in order to make that possible. And then here you go. It's where I am.
How has the journey been till now, over the past 2 years? I mean, it is not easy to, go for a first tech-based startup. And I'm sure there are a lot of obstacles, even given the fact that, sometimes as a solo female founder, you could face obstacles. Were there any challenges on that front? And how did you even overcome them?
And I have to say, it was a real shock to see in this day and age how dominant this field is by men. And I mean, I came up in the art world in the 90s. I experienced that, in early days with very few women were being represented. That's largely changed now. So part of me was like, oh, we've, really gone over these humps. And then I get into the business world and I was like, wow, I am so often the only woman in the room. And then there's also this perception that like, if you are a female founder, that you're doing something regarding things that like affect women, like, oh, you make makeup or you are dealing with childcare or tech for home things. It's like, no, I'm actually, I'm a tech entrepreneur building for the masses. And I happen to be a woman. And it was mostly shocking, actually, to be frank. And then hearing from people who would say, well, we need to build your profile because there's already going to be a slight against you because you're a woman. Like hearing that, from advisors who are saying it's going to be hard for you to get investment. Oh, do you know only 3% of female founders get investment? Was shocking. And it wasn't something that I had anticipated. And frankly, those kinds of scenarios, anytime something like that just only makes me want it more. It puts me in the situation where it's like, oh, you think that there are these obstacles and it's like something that has absolutely nothing to do with me, then I'm going to overcome them. But it did take quite a bit to adjust to. And then in the early days when we were building out the prototype, I would get on these calls with tech development firms along with my CTO at the time, who was male, and they would ask him all the questions. And then he would ask me the questions and then I would answer the questions. And even after that happened, they would still ask Sean the questions. So, I mean, right. I was like, wow, it's literally like I'd have to have him on the call just so people would ask questions so that I can answer them. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous, but it unfortunately did happen. And it is frankly something I am still dealing with. And we are looking for investment now. I very often will see these panels and they're mostly white men. And they're looking for people that many times I think it's not a design. It's like that these many people who are investors are former entrepreneurs. So if most of the former entrepreneurs are white men, then at least in the United States, then those who are going to then be the investors, they're looking for people who remind them of themselves when they were coming up. And so there's a bias there that isn't intended, but it exists. And that is something that I will continue to work with. And we will have, next podcast, I'll let you know.
Right, yeah. Yeah, like it's going to be regardless, right? You're going to move up, you're going to move forward regardless. Does it also affect, as you mentioned, like why does the funding aspect get affected so much? I mean, investors should be more concerned about the product, about the business, about the revenue stream, about the business plan.
Big questions.
So, yeah, exactly. I am. Like whatever you've seen.
All I can offer is some of the ideas that I've had. And I think one of them kind of occurred to me was that, like I had said, that the investors are often former entrepreneurs. If that group continues to be homogenous and then they look for people who are like them, because that kind of like gives them that innate sense like, oh, I did well. And this person reminds me of me. And I think they're going to do well. That's one potential possibility. I mean, in business in general, there's still, women make less. We don't get promoted as often. But in the startup world, that kind of networking, hanging out, having a drink. I went to a networking event that was at a cigar bar. I was the only woman there. There's another one coming up. It's like a poker night, And so there is this almost like it's surrounded in kind of a male culture. Let's meet each other face to face. You tell me your ideas. Maybe I'll give you some money, that kind of thing. And that actually is super foreign to me because I haven't been involved in traditional business. I've been involved in the art world, which has a very different way of interacting and engaging. It has its own systemic issues. Don't get me wrong.
Right.
But even in recognizing that I was entering into these situations where a lot of it is the pat on the back or the like, oh, let's have a cigar together kind of a thing. I think that somewhat perpetuates that because I think many people don't feel comfortable in that situation. It's not one that they're familiar with. But beyond that, I mean, it is shocking because the data is that female entrepreneurs are much better at utilizing the money. And they have a really good track record. So it kind of like, hello, investors, you're leaving money on the table. But like I said, big questions I don't really have the answers to. I'm just,
Right.
figuring
No, fair enough.
how to maneuver through it at this time.
No, yeah, the idea was just kind of understanding
Yeah.
a bit from your perspective, since you're right there in the center of entrepreneurship, and as a female founder, of course. But let's get back to the art and the entrepreneurship in terms of envisioning blockchain technology with art. Again, like, what role does Nerfwork play in the whole transformation, and where do you see this kind of technology impacting in the near future as well?
So, like I said, when I felt like there was not a structure that was built to actually realize the promises of what blockchain was saying, is that once we kind of dug into thinking about how do we make this happen, the very first thing was a wallet. We needed a wallet so that collectors could purchase the art in a way that made sense. Because so many of the collectors that I'd talked to who'd maybe considered buying an NFT and then dropped out because things like MetaMask just were too difficult to understand or manage. But that ended up being such a small step, because what needed to be built was all of it, like the full technology stack that's going to make sure that each point on that line is going to be facilitated in a way that has longevity and makes sense and is secure. So we are building basically a full technology stack from cradle to grave, the artworks cradle to grave. It's going to take some time, so we're doing it little by little. The first one being that, which is essentially a digital wallet. The next one is to onboard galleries so that their inventories are on the blockchain and therefore have more NFT-backed artworks to sell to those collectors with that wallet. Now, when I say NFT-backed artworks, by the way, I mean all art. Painting, sculpture, video, performance, all of it.
Right.
There's a huge misunderstanding about what an NFT is, because there was this massive craze and people really associated the word NFT with digital artwork. But in fact, the digital artwork lives on Web 2. The only thing that an NFT is it says that you own it. So it can work for anything. And in fact, one of the sort of the discrepancies between someone who comes from an art background and talking to people who are engaging in this technology who don't have an art background is that sort of assumption that they invented the idea that the object doesn't have to exist. And when I have, there's this treatise, it's a seminal work that for art students we all read. It's called Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, and it was written in 1935. And it essentially addresses what makes an object valuable if it's no longer unique. So it's an addition, or it's a digital image, or it's any of those things. So this is something that in the art world has been in discussion for well over a century. Then you have Lucy Lepard's 6 years in the dematerialization of the art object from 1966 to 1972. And that was written in 1973, and it's about the dematerialization of an art object. So I think one of the reasons why NFT ideology makes sense to the art world is because we've recognized that the object can exist, but it doesn't need to exist for the art to be valid and valuable. That means, though, that what makes an artwork valuable is another criteria. And that was something that was missing from those first attempts to, create sort of the NFT market, was to understand what makes something valuable. If it isn't unique or it isn't an object, where is its value? This is something we've discussed, written about, treatise. Many artists have addressed it for, like I said, a century at this point. So we have a really deep understanding of what that means and what that looks like. But on the other side, that wasn't there. And that's kind of why we felt like it was necessary to bring someone from the art community into the role of building for the art community so that we could build things that made sense for who we are and what we're doing.
Right. It's a very interesting concept. So when you started off initially, what was your outlook towards what your processes are going to look like, and how did you approach the whole beginning of, starting the company? I'm just very curious to understand, what was your process like?
Okay. Well, yeah, most artists have a business. But it's a sole proprietorship generally. And then I've built nonprofits. I've built other businesses in the past, but definitely nothing in the tech world and definitely nothing within that sort of startup founder looking for investment, build that kind of thing. So this was a brand new journey for me. And in the very beginning, the first thing I did was reach out to my alma mater, Temple University, the Innovation and Entrepreneur Institute at Temple University, which is available. I used to teach there, so it's available to professors, alumni, of which I also was one, and current students. And frankly, had they not been so open and available to me and providing mentorship right away, I don't know if I would be where I am today, because I was really starting from scratch. Now, I had management experiences in many different varieties, but this was specific, as you're mentioning. And to get that sort of mentorship right away really helped me figure out how to move along on this process. But I'll tell you, absolutely, there are things that I would do differently now if I was to do it all over again, because it was a massive learning curve and you're only getting little bits of information as you go along. And I did often get, I like to think of the big picture. I wanted to see it out 10 years. And as I was beginning, I would ask these questions and they would say, oh, you're not there yet. You're not there. Don't worry about that now. You're not, worry about this thing, And I do think that in order to be successful at strategy, like having the bigger picture and really understanding all the pieces helps you make decisions even in the now. And I can see why investors are interested in serial entrepreneurs for that reason. There's, like you said, there's just a lot of things that are unexpected that happen along your journey. You have to figure them out as they come. And if you're doing it with this kind of like horse blinders on, so you only can see the short in front of you, then you can't be as strategic if you understand the full landscape. So there were some starts and stops as I was figuring those things out. And also, you're getting lots of different advice from various different ways. The other thing that just happens is like the market changes. I mean, when I started this, there was massive amounts of investment going into blockchain. And then it literally dried up right about the time I was ready. Investment. And these are things that, even with knowledge, and foresight, you wouldn't know because markets change, they're volatile.
Right.
A lot of it had to do with various political unrest around the world, all of these things that are like not necessarily predictable. And those are things that you manage along the way. And I would say that if I was to give advice to any founder, I think that the most important thing is to, in those moments where it feels like, wow, this is not going to happen, just to remember that this happens to everybody, that we all go through these ups and downs, and that it is a marathon, not a race. So, something maybe you planned on getting your investment within 3 months and then you suddenly don't have it. It's like persevere and work through it. And that has served me in multiple different ways throughout my lifetime. And that's where, also community comes in. Like some of these, I would have to say the Philadelphia startup community is a really strong community. And I really have had so much support from the people in it. So that when you're in those dark moments or you're like, wow, did I just waste my time and money and energy? And they can say, oh, girl, we've been here before. And so I really have to say, I would like to give a shout out to the Innovation Entrepreneur Internship at Temple University, to the SBDC, and to the Philly Startup Leaders, among many others, that really helps me out along my journey.
Yeah, it's great to know that kind of support exists, right? I think this is something I'm also very hooked to the idea of startup ecosystem, is the support that is really around. So there are so many learnings that you can also kind of gain from each other just by the network, just by the support, just by building a community around it. I really like the energy of the entire ecosystem that is around the startup space. But some advice for entrepreneurs who are starting out new in terms of how to really take their product development, or what things to consider, how do you really navigate through them? So any wisdom would really help our listeners to integrate it into their own journeys.
One of the things that was maybe something that I didn't expect, but happened to be the case, is when I was starting off and I was getting a lot of advice and I was pivoting and changing and growing, that I kept getting like, wow, you pivot very easily, or you're very, very good at being able to explain what you're trying to do. And I was like, these are actually skill sets that I learned in art school. I mean, what we do in art school is build things that didn't exist before and then explain them to an audience criticizes us. I mean, that's essentially the platform of art school. And so it wouldn't have occurred to me had I not gone into the startup world, but that creative problem solving education that art school offers really helped set me up to be a successful entrepreneur. And what it recognized to me, and something that I would like to say to the startup world, is to utilize artists. I mean, when I have worked in other non-for-profits and other things, I've had so many interns who are artists, and you give them something and say, figure it out, and they figure it out because that's what they're trained to do. And when I've worked with other young people who maybe come with a business background or something like that, they want like the delineation, like step A, step B, step C, because so much of other learning is empirical. There's like, you do this first and then you do this and you need this. In the art school, it isn't like that at all. There is no empirical knowledge. You are building it from scratch. And so that level of problem solving and thinking skills and creativity, I think has been untapped in the business world in ways that now that I see that education being so essential to particularly working in these situations where you might have more of you have to have like a generalist job because there isn't 50 people, there's 5, that art background and training has really come into play. Now, what that might mean is like more artists should be comfortable becoming entrepreneurs, or entrepreneurs should consider hiring artists. And by artists, I mean musicians, visual artists, all of us who are constantly making and growing and changing and doing it with budgets that most CEOs would cry with, but still making it happen. And that kind of the moxie, the belief, and the ability is something that very much aligns with being an entrepreneur.
Right. Yeah, I do agree, because an artist can actually have the freedom of coming to a solution with a little more non-structured approach, right? And I do relate to that a lot. But Francesca, I mean, this has been so insightful and it was a very interesting conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Today.
I've really enjoyed talking to you, and I'm excited that we were able to create this podcast together.
Yeah, likewise. And I'd be very excited to do this podcast again, maybe after a year when you are already at the path to success. You're already there. We would love
Fingers crossed.
Good luck with that. And thank you so much again, for this enlightening conversation. And it was interesting to explore the intersection of blockchain and art. This is the first for me to kind of understand. So I'll just close telling this to our listeners that just remember to visit Nerftwork's website at www.nerftwork, which is NEFTWERK.com, to learn more about the innovative solution and shaping the future of art world. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to the inspiring conversation that we had with Francesca Augustine. So until next time, thank you so much. See you on TekTalk with Sodhi. Thanks a lot.